Okay, the Synchro-Compur shutter from our Retina 3C. I'm ready to work on this now. So I'll remove the retaining ring, remove our shims. Shims may or may not be present, they're usually there. Unscrew the rear group. You should only need to unscrew that with your fingers. Occasionally they're a bit tighter than that because someone's been a bit too enthusiastic. Remove the front group. That's a bit fingerprinty, but that'll all clean away. And here's our shutter. We have a screw here that locks the front retaining ring. It's small, very shallow. You get about a turn and a half on that one. So it is fairly easy to damage. Make sure you have a screwdriver that fits it well and you should be good. Now I'm choosing a toothpick to unscrew the retaining ring rather than the tip of a screwdriver or the tip of the tweezers, because that'll prevent the likelihood of any scratching. So that can come off. Here we have the lens mount. Here's the follower dial for the aperture settings. Pull this piece off. Here's our shutter speed setting ring, and this is the little coupling ring here that couples to the aperture setting on the camera body here, couples to this piece, and in this case that's very stiff. What else we got here? This is our shutter speed settings cam. These cam lobes that you see here control the retard gear train. From the front we can remove the shutter release. This little latch, its job is to stop you from being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter is not actually cocked. Just lift the internal cocking ring off the shutter. The pinion that cocks the main drive cam here. You can unhook the spring from the main drive cam, and I'll inspect that. And this one's very, very tired. Right, the story with these. So as it sits in the camera, this is the downside we're seeing at the top here. See, the tab points up here at about the 12 o'clock position. That's where it latches into the bracket that holds it. And at this point, at about the 4 o'clock position, you'll see the vertical end of the spring where it latches into the main drive cam. This is an example of a spring that is tired and lacks the push it should have. It doesn't have enough tension, particularly right at the closing point where it should close the shutter blades. In an ideal world, if this is taken at 12 o'clock here, this vertical tab would be sitting at about a 2 o'clock position. If it's sitting at about the 3 o'clock position, that is quite good. If it's sitting between the 3 and the 4 o'clock position, that's probably about normal in this world, because these parts are just no longer available. This one here is exceptionally tired, and I will want to find another example that's better than that. I certainly don't have any new ones, but I can probably find a better one. What effect would that have? Well, it would have two noticeable effects. It would certainly affect the speed, the top speed that you could reasonably expect the shutter to achieve. And in a case like this where the shutter's old and tired and it's quite gummed up. It's quite sticky in its action. The spring would lack enough energy, particularly when it was almost in the closed position, to actually get the blades to fully close that last little bit. It's certainly a liability. I'm just going to remove the main drive cam here now, and I notice that's a bit sticky in its action. Right, now to start stripping a few things out of here. 2 screws hold the retard gear train in position. Now I'm just throwing all these components in one container because I'm very familiar with them and I know exactly what goes where. But if you're not familiar with them, you'd be laying these components out very carefully in line with their appropriate screws, and probably with taking copious pictures as you go in so you know exactly where everything came from. Single screw here holds the self-timer or delay action in place. This mechanism here is the flash sync mechanism. I'll just cock that, unhook that spring so it's not under tension and therefore won't go flying across the room, or is less likely to go flying across the room. Already had to chase one screw from this camera so far. Removing flash contact. This piece is reluctant to come out. I'm not sure why. Let's try another pair of tweezers. That's better. Got to unhook the spring here from this lever. That operates the pallets, or that sector gear operates the pallets. I've got to find the right pliers. Normally I put a screwdriver in behind the arm on that lever so it can't move backwards, then push that spring forward so I can unhook it. That way I don't need to stretch the spring out far in order to unhook it, and therefore the spring's not going to get distorted or damaged in the process. So we can remove that sector arm there, remove the pallet wheel, and we're down to a few other components. Now I'll zoom in a bit closer. Wrong way. Let's see if I can get this into view for you. Where are we? About there. This spring I've got to unhook. So I put a toothpick over the centre over that post so that it cannot ping away, and unhook the end of it, and then I can lift that spring out. It's very small and it's easily lost. Springs like that are easily lost and are very small tend to be hard to find replacements for because everybody's already used the replacements. Now the screw here holds the B lever in position. Remove that. That has quite a long spring on it. The B lever can come out. That was just the camera telling me that I'd run out of space. I just lifted the B lever off here, and I'm just about to lift off the B lever return spring. Again, I'm putting a toothpick over the post so that the spring can't get away. It allows me to unhook that spring, and then I can lift it off the post. And again, it's a small spring, easily lost. I'll drop that in that container. That's looking pretty stripped at the top of the shutter. I need to turn my attention to the bottom of the shutter. I have to move things a bit closer to the camera here, I can see. So, at the bottom, 3 screws hold the shutter case, the outer case to the shutter case, and normally there are 3 screws present and they are the correct screws. Sometimes they're not the correct screws, or they're not all present. There's a little screw at the side here that holds that flash contact in place. Now we can slide the case off, the outer case I mean. Here's a curved rack that couples to that transfer shaft, and it pushes this curved pusher here, which actually cocks the shutter. And here's the outer case. Not an awful lot to go wrong with those typically, though having said that, there's always cases where there is something wrong. Right, let's have a look at this. Come on camera, focus, that's better. 3 screws hold our aperture setting lever on the back of the shutter. Now these screws are unusually tight. They're only very small, these screws. There's usually not much need to be going crazy doing them up. You're only likely to strip them out or strip the thread on them, or both. So there's our settings lever. This is quite oily. It should be free from oil. This shim, that's very oily. Broad flat surfaces like that tend to stick things. This lever sets our self timer or the flash sync. Now I'm just going to check the setting, the diaphragm, because the diaphragm setting was quite stiff before I took it apart. I want to see what it's like now. It's still quite stiff. And looking at those blades, see if I can get this, yeah, you can just see it in the camera. You can see the tips of the blades are bright and shiny. That's oil, and that oil tends to stick things together. That's a problem that's always worse in cold weather than warm weather, because the oils become more viscous. 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together, and just like the other screws, these ones are unusually tight. I'm keeping lots of downward pressure on the screwdriver to stop it camming out and slipping and damaging the screw. Lift off the shutter case. Here we have the two halves of the shutter, if you like. The shutter case, which contains the diaphragm blades, and the mechanism plate that holds the control gear on the front, and at the rear of the mechanism plate you can see our shutter blades. And the shutter blades here, as you can probably see right in the middle there, are quite dirty. It's got oil or something on those blades. Now oil tends to stick these blades. You can see the sheen of oil around those edges there too. So all these pieces have got to be stripped and cleaned. And normally with the shutter I start with the case. Clean and strip this. Then turn my attention to the mechanism plate. Strip that. Make sure it's completely free from oil and grease. Check it for any serious problems. Serious problems that you're likely to encounter, probably the most common one would be corrosion. You're going to make sure that there's no corrosion and work out what you're going to do about it if there is. See, the diaphragm blades are actually stuck here to the that plate. That's very oily. You can probably see the sheen of oil on there, particularly towards the centre. Here's our blades. Again, they're very filthy. They get a bit of an odd colour to them too. Some of that's bright oil. Some of it's got sort of a grey stain to it, almost like a zebra stripe there. And that's where the blades have sat at some other position for some time. It's almost like graphite powder's been involved there. Whether someone had applied some graphite powder to it in an attempt to make it work smoothly, I don't know. And here's our case. You can see there's quite a big smear of graphite grease there. Someone's greased that. It doesn't really require that. There's no need to do that. And at the back of the case here, if you can get that in the light correct. No, it's not going to do it, is it? There's a big sheen of oil around here. It's very yellow. That's oil. That oil would have come out of the focus helical most likely. Okay, so these parts need to be cleaned up, and I'll start with the case, clean up the diaphragm blades, the retainer plate and so forth, reassemble this and move on. All these components need to be cleaned, and I'm just using some naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid. And I'm starting at the rear of the case. I just need to get rid of all that old oil. Most of that oil will have come through from the lens focus helical. And the inside of the case. Well, most of this is fairly good. Bit of graphite grease there that was put there to lubricate that little detent spring, and you do need something on that detent spring. That's probably just a little bit enthusiastic with the application, but round that inside edge someone has gone to the trouble of lubricating that with graphite grease. That's for the aperture settings ring, and that was unnecessary and unhelpful. The graphite itself would have caused no problem there, but the graphite of course is suspended in an oily binder, and the volatiles from that will have just volatilized and settled where you don't want them to be. That's their normal practice. That case is looking pretty good. I'll give it one more wipe. Inside and out. That's good. That to one side. Here, this is the retainer. The retainer plate holds the diaphragm blades in position. This is quite oily, I can tell by the colour of it. It's got quite a rainbow sheen to it. Let's see if that'll come off. Especially this side. This side faces the shutter blades. It's oilier still. Now, it's commonly stated that there should be no oil in a shutter, and you don't need to oil a shutter, and that's entirely true. But people often take that to mean that you don't need to lubricate a shutter, and that's not true. Here's the moving ring that swings the aperture blades inwards as you move the diaphragm setting lever. This is quite oily, and this ring would be in direct contact with that graphite grease around the outside edge on the rear face. This is the front face we're looking at here, the face towards the blades. This is the rear face. And as you can see, you can go through a fair number of cotton buds cleaning these components to get them to a decent state. That's easy for me because of course I'm self-employed. I'm the person who makes the decision about how many cotton buds I can use and purchase when I need more. It was a bit different when I worked for Kodak because they were reluctant to spend money on things like that if they didn't have to, so consumables were sort of rationed out in probably a less than helpful way. The blades. Let's have a look at these blades. They're quite stained. Hopefully those stains are just on the surface and will come away with the cleaning. But I'm about to find out. Sometimes those stains are semi-permanent. The oils will sometimes, as the volatiles go away, often they'll dry out and they'll harden up like a lacquer, and that lacquer does not wipe away. We'll see how we get on here. That's looking pretty good. There's a bit of discoloration or marking to it, but it's very slight. Generally speaking, that's a vast improvement compared to its mates, as you can see. In fact, it even looks different. You'll notice it's light in colour, and it's light in colour because the oil has been removed from the surface. Its mates here are black and shiny by comparison. Now I'm using the back of my tweezers to hold this down in place, but this is a curved pair of tweezers. I'm quite careful with the amount of pressure I apply on the blades like that. Do not want to damage those blades or bend them in any way. It's less of a problem with a rangefinder camera like this because you are not reliant on the blades moving at any particular high speed when you shift them into position, unlike on a leaf shuttered SLR. But by the same token, you do not want any undue stiffness there that's been caused by the blades being distorted. It's always a bit difficult to clean around the little pivots. And you have to be careful not to leave threads of cotton behind on those pivots. Sometimes a thread of cotton might tangle round them. Last one. I'm still in frame, that's good. Well, they don't look like new, but they look pretty good. Quite happy with the state of those. And that diaphragm can be reassembled, so I need the assembly jig.